Hello, welcome to week 8 of this course on assessments. And this is the last module wherein we will look at how to use technology to improve the overall assessment experience. So we will begin by looking at the technologies that can be used for assessments. So we look at technology-based assessments to begin with. And once we have understood the overall concepts of technology-based assessments, we will get into Moodle as an open source learning management system and see how Moodle can be used for assessments, which will include to understand the various types of activities that Moodle supports for the purpose of assessments, how to create and manage a question bank, and how to administer quizzes that make use of these question banks. And of course, we cannot ignore the role of AI in assessments as well. So we will look at the role of generative AI in assessments and what are some of the best practices. So let's begin by reviewing the assessment life cycle, right? So throughout these 6 or 7 weeks, you have seen the different nuances associated with assessments at great detail. So you can consider this to be some kind of a review of the various concepts that were already covered, but we will position that in the context of technology. So we will look at about 8 stages in the life cycle of assessments, okay? And I have broken this down into these 8 stages, broadly mapping it to the role of different tools and technologies that can be brought in to make these activities, these stages in this life cycle more effective, okay? So let's begin by looking at each one of them, okay? The first thing that I want to talk about is this notion of an assessment item, right? So this can be viewed as the smallest component of any assessment, okay? And in a more general way, this is referred to as a question in a question paper, right? So, and then we have already seen that there can be many different types of items, right? So item types can be multiple choice questions, fill in the blanks, match the following, and so many, a variety of them that are available. And then we can also have more descriptive type of items, items that require a descriptive type of responses, short answer, long answer, diagrams, programming, right? So there are a whole range of assessment items that you have already seen, and you have also seen that associated with these assessment types, how it maps to the Bloom's taxonomy, right? So how do you map it to course outcomes, right? So these aspects have already been talked about. Assessment instrument is another term which is much more commonly referred to as a question paper. But you can think of an assessment instrument to be a collection of items and generally administered together as a single activity, right? So you assemble lots of assessment items and create an assessment instrument for the purpose of conducting one specific assessment. So as I said, it need not necessarily be limited to a question paper, although that is the most common type of an assessment instrument that we come across. But we can have an assessment instrument which is in the form of a simulator, right, which includes lots of tasks to be carried out, and each task can be viewed as an assessment item, okay? So I think the critical understanding, for now that you are at the end of this assessment course, it is important to be able to generalize many of the most common things that we know, right? So that is why I am being very conscious here and using the term assessment item instead of calling it as a question, because this is the time for us to realize that an assessment item can be something more than just a question that you are asking. Along similar lines, an assessment instrument need not necessarily be a question paper alone. So which means that even the nature of that instrument can be classified into different types based on the purpose, right? So you talk about diagnostic assessments. So when you talk about diagnostic assessments, the instrument type also can vary, right? So the instrument type, the instrument for diagnosis will be very different from, say, a formative assessment or a summative assessment. So which means that depending upon the assessment type, the assessment instrument can also vary. Okay. So once you have created an assessment instrument, we need to be able to execute that activity, right? So generally we just call that as examination, and that's just an example of how an assessment can be executed or administered. But basically we are saying that we have to create an environment wherein you will administer this particular assessment and create a mechanism to collect responses to those to that assessment, okay, on the basis of that particular given assessment instrument. So which means that when we talk about different types of executions of those assessments, this can be conducted in an online manner. This can be by, we can call everybody to a specific examination center and then carry out that particular assessment in person. And these days, especially in higher educations, we talk about open book, we talk about closed book, we talk about take home, right? So all kinds of ways are there to execute a specific assessment activity. Okay, and we also need not always think that the moment we think of examinations, then we imagine people carrying examination pads, papers, distribution, pen, pencils, drawing instruments, etc., etc., etc. But then there are newer types of assessments are also emerging, wherein suppose it's a communication course. In the communication course, I'm interested in evaluating their spoken skills. So the assessment instrument could be a recorded audio, and the response also can be an audio, right? So we can have a spoken response as well, right? So there could be assessments which require some physical activities to be done, especially in in physical intensive disciplines like mechanical engineering, civil engineering. So there could be some activities that need to be carried out on the field, right? So there are also, so we have to acknowledge that those assessment types are also relevant, especially in these days, wherein we in the previous module we talked about internship, right? So basically experiential learning. So experiential learning need not be limited only to internships. So experiential learning is something that needs to be incorporated right through their learning journey. And the moment you introduce experiential learning, you need a way to assess that experience that they have gained. And that is where other forms of non-examination type of no pen and paper writing kind of assessments will also come into the picture. But then it is not as if we call everybody and to an examination hall and then say carry out give the responses. Obviously, we have to create mechanisms to collect those responses. The reason I am calling this out, although it may sound extremely obvious, so you may say that administering the assessments, which was the previous task, and collecting the responses, though it is true that both are carried out together, but there is a reason why I am calling them out as separate things, because the specific logistics that are associated can be very different. Okay, because as part of the collecting the responses, the mere design of your the tool that you use to collect the responses can vary. For example, it could be a simple a simple answer book, right? So you just give a plain answer book. In the first page, you write their roll number and responses, and then you give them a printout of the question paper, and then they will write the responses. On the other hand, there could be another way to collect the responses. Now, this is something that many people already use, right? Wherein you print the answer booklet along with the questions themselves. Okay, and then you give the answer book. There's no separate question paper that is given. So what is the advantage of this particular model? So in this particular model, you collect the responses in the answer book itself. So the question and the answer books are there together, and the advantage is that you give a fixed amount of space for them to write answers, right? If that is something that you expect and you expect them to write precise, concise answers, that is a way to do that. But of course, you should keep in mind the downside is that the length of the question paper itself can become very lengthy, and it requires greater effort to create an answer booklet which has got questions already pre-printed in them. Okay, but typically large scale examinations do follow this particular format. On the other hand, if it is an online if in the previous step of administering the assessment you had followed the online method, then obviously there is no need to print any answer booklets, but then you have to worry more about the infrastructure, computing infrastructure, internet, etc., right? So that is also an equally complex activity. So this collecting responses we should not underestimate in this overall scheme of things. Okay, and especially since this particular module is focused on technology enabled assessments, so we will, when we go through the next sub module, then we will see that we will be using specific tools to bring in technology to make this process of collecting the responses easy. Incidentally, while I am going through each of the steps of this life cycle, please make a note or realize that I'm going to be bringing technology in each of those 8 steps. So we will be looking at where technology can help us in each of these 8 steps that we are going to be talking about. Okay, so evaluation is basically the task of grading, right? Grading a response. So somebody you assessed a specific assessment item, you administered a specific assessment item, the learner gave the response. So how do you grade it, right? So that is the task of evaluation, and basically assigning marks to an MCQ response based on whether it's a right answer, wrong answer, listening to an audio response and awarding marks like we just talked about. Here also now we can talk about partial marks, full marks, right? So and also even in MCQ there could be single response, there could be multiple responses, right? So maybe the name of the nature of the assessment item was such that it will require them to select more than one response to a single question. So there are lots of complications that can arise, right? So whether it is especially with partial grading, even with MCQs these days, we can do partial grading, and I will show you how to do that. Okay, so which means that this gives you lots of flexibility in terms of how you evaluate. Okay, and just in terms of the evaluation types themselves, the one that we are most familiar with and comfortable with probably are assigning numbers, some kind of a marks to each of the question. You say 2 out of 3 and things like that, right? And especially if your assessment instrument is MCQ, we are usually not used to partial grading with MCQs, but I will show you how we can do partial grading with MCQs as well. Okay, so and then of course the other very something which is becoming more popular, especially at a higher education level, especially for elective courses and so on, are letter grades. Okay, so you may ask them to do a little bit of a research and then write a term paper, right? It is difficult to assign numeric grades to a term paper. So people will come up with some kind of a rubric which will result in letter grades being awarded to such assessment instruments. Okay, I'm not using the term question paper here, right? So which means that those kind of evaluations can also be there. And the last bullet that you see there, which is in the evaluation type, is about to what extent is automation brought in. Okay, so we can have these evaluations take place in a completely manual manner, right? So you have graders who are given some kind of an assessment rubric, and then they will go through each of those responses and then assign marks in a manual way, right? Much of the larger examinations till date, they still follow the manual evaluation systems, but lots of automation is being brought into many higher education institutions already. Okay, so wherein the especially assessments that are involving MCQs are fully automated these days, right? So all the way from national level examinations like JEE and the GATE examination to even quizzes that are being conducted inside educational institutions. And there can be a need to do some kind of a partial automation. So you do a hybrid kind of an evaluation wherein certain components are evaluated partially and certain components are evaluated manually, and there could be variations of them. Okay. Once these individual assessment items are evaluated, so we need to be able to put them together, right? So which means that how do you aggregate them across all the assessment items and assessment instruments for the whole class? Okay, so which means the basic simple task you can call them as computing the total marks, okay, or assigning, as I said, sometimes you may not really assign marks at an individual level, but eventually you may convert them, convert the total marks into some kind of a letter grade. Okay, depending upon the academic institution, this can result in a grade of A, B, C, D, and F, which is what it is in our institution, or there can be variations that you can bring in of A minus, A plus, B plus, and so on, right? With so every institution can have their own ways of letter grades, computing the letter grades. But in terms of the methods of aggregation, that can also vary, right? So we can have aggregations which are absolute total, right? You simply conduct the assessment based on an assessment instrument. If the assessment instrument has got, say, 260 marks, and then you simply total them up against all the individual assessment items, and then you compute the total as marks out of 260, right? For example, the JEE, for example, I think they conduct the assessments for 360 marks, right? So, and then you can publish saying that out of 360, this is what you got. And you can alternatively, or in addition to computing the total, you can also convert that into a percentage. It can be a plain percentage or it can be a weighted percentage, because if there are multiple components to that assessment itself, each one might be having a different amount of weight that you are giving, and so you can do a weighted percentage as well. Okay, and something that I have not mentioned in the slide right now is even releasing the what is known as a percent rank, which is sometimes confused with a percentile. They are related, but there's a subtle difference. So what you do is based on you sort all the marks that are obtained by all the people in say descending order, and then you say that you assign a percentage as a rank, right? So you say that how many people are below this particular student, right? So which means that the person who is at the first rank will always get the 100% rank. Okay, so the 100% rank and then keeps going down and down depending upon the number of people below that particular current student. So that is also becoming quite a popular thing. Okay, and interestingly, what is the connection between percent rank and percentile? So the percent rank, for example, you say that 90% rank, and what is the percentile of the 90% rank? 90% rank is the actual marks obtained by a student who is at the 90% rank. So that is what we call as the 90th percentile. Okay. So there could be many ways of aggregating this, right? So you have to look at all of them. Interestingly, there are also increasing need to do this binary form of aggregation, right? Binary form of aggregation is, we spoke in the last module about internships, right? Normally, we can generally say that at the overall curriculum level, all we want is them to go through that experience. So if they have gone through the experience, we'll simply say that it is satisfactory, right? And then you can come up with something. If you want them to do something more, some more work, maybe they were not able to complete the 4 months necessary, maybe they were ill, and so you will say that it's either you say call it as not satisfactory, or you call it as incomplete. No, the nomenclature can vary, but typically it can be a binary form of the fine aggregation as well. Okay. Once we have completed the overall evaluation, okay, we have to make this available to the learners or students. Okay, so that is as simple as that. So basically, it involves, if it is a marks that you have computed, or a percentage that you have computed, you have to reveal the marks of an assessment to the students. Okay. Now, there are many ways to release these assessments. Okay, so depending upon the nature of the examination that was conducted and so on, and the more traditional way is open publication of results. Okay, which in the newspaper. Okay, so there are still some of these assessments that are conducted at nationwide, wherein these results are announced in an open forum like a newspaper. Okay, newspaper. And I have also seen, I hope it is still not practiced, but publishing the results in the notice board, the marks obtained in the notice board of the educational institutions. I'm just saying that it is one of the ways of doing it. I'm not necessarily saying that that is the right way to do that. Okay, what is becoming a more accepted norm is personalized release of the results, right? So these days we talk a lot about privacy and so on. So we have to be, as educationists, we have to be sensitive to these aspects. Okay, so which means that we personalized release of the results. What do we mean by that is that the results, the marks obtained, for example, or the grade obtained, is known only to the student. Okay, so it is not widely publicized. So another mistake that I'm seeing, that I'm familiar with, right, wherein you simply upload the results, in the form of an Excel file. No, you don't put it in the notice board, but you upload it and you upload it or send it as an email to all the students, right? So which is definitely defeating the purpose. So it is as bad as putting it up in the notice board. Okay. Yes. So there could be other legal requirements which because of which this in the interest of transparency. So there may be requirements that you do have to publish it in a newspaper, but we are not talking about those. I am talking about in a typical academic setting, there is no such requirement. There is no such requirement that we have to reveal every student's grade to every other student. There is absolutely no such requirement. So especially in an academic setting, this should not be, option 1 should never be used of open publication. Okay. And finally, we can also decide, depending upon the nature of the institution and the policies of the institution, whether to reveal only the final marks or the grade, or do you also release the item level assessments, right? So item level evaluation, do you also release the item level evaluation? That also is an option. There could be lots of variations on that. So I'm not really going to be really judging which is better, which is not better. But obviously, releasing the full evaluation at an item level increases the level of transparency, and also it serves the purpose of learning. For example, if you are doing a formative assessment and not a summative assessment, right? If you recall, formative assessment is something that is conducted in between, more to give feedback. So if you are trying to conduct a formative assessment, but then you don't reveal the item level item level evaluations, then it doesn't serve the purpose of the student trying to learn from the mistakes that they have done and improving. Okay, so again, this may also be dependent upon the nature of the assessment that you are conducting. Okay. Last but not the least, which is usually forgotten and not factored in, is this possibility or the need to give opportunities for re-evaluation. Okay, so re-evaluation based on this. So this is tightly coupled to step 7, right? So how much of it have you released, right? So depending upon how much you have released, so there may be a need to give the opportunity for re-evaluation. Okay, so now you must have seen that for national level exams, including CBSE and everybody, so they have different ways of giving this opportunity. Okay, so these days they publish the entire the answer written by the student, and you can ask for re-evaluation. Okay, so it can be at an item level or it can be at the overall examination level, right? Until the time more recently, the entire answer books are available online for people to look at it and what is the item level evaluation that has been done. But prior to that, only based on the total marks, if you have a gut feel that you probably did better than what the marks reveal, then you can ask for re-evaluation. So there could be lots of variations that is possible, and the technology, the extent to which this entire life cycle is technology enabled, also determines the extent of re-evaluation you are able to provide. Okay, because as you know, until they've been able to upload the entire answer books for CBSE, it was not possible. All those answer books were safely kept in some secure location, and the only option available was to ask for re-evaluation based on my gut feel. Okay, and the re-evaluation purpose, the purpose for the re-evaluation also we have to keep in mind, right? The earlier they used to call it as re-evaluation, wherein this is mainly to look at the totaling, right? So if you have an physical answer book wherein the evaluators have written down the marks, so they used to also manually total it and enter it into the system or wherever, right? So the re-evaluation process allowed only retotaling. So there used to be a retotaling as a separate activity and re-evaluation as a separate activity. So as a student, you could ask for retotaling or re-evaluation, right? So what you will realize now is that in this whole 8-step process, right, technology can bring in enormous amount of flexibility and empowerment in this whole process, empowerment to the institutions, empowerment to the learners in this whole process. That also, right, which means that now the greater the amount of technology you bring in, greater is the flexibility that you bring even to re-evaluation. Now people can even look at single rounds to multiple rounds. Okay, so this is definitely, we keep routinely seeing that in one round of evaluation, somebody points out that even for MCQs there is an error in the answer, and then you go through the whole re-evaluation, not just of the entire one single paper, but lakhs of papers also can get re-evaluated. And then all those things will be possible only when you bring in technology. All right. So just to summarize, right, so assessments can be quite complex with many activities. And the more you are able to break that down into more granular activities, the greater is the opportunity that you have to bring in technology interventions, right? So which means that the more fine-grained you make your overall assessment, greater is the amount of technology interventions that you can bring. So the 8-stage intervention, 8-stage life cycle that I introduced as part of this particular module is an indicator that technology interventions can be brought in for each of those 8 stages. Okay, and that is precisely the goal for the rest of this particular module, wherein we will use specifically, we will use Moodle as an example technology learning management system in which many of these, if not all of these things can be done. And I would and whatever we are saying, you don't have to be worried that, oh, okay, this is so Moodle specific. In my education institution, I'm using something else. But then the specific tasks may vary in terms of where you click, which button you choose, but the activity itself can be supported in any learning management system. Okay. All right. So on that sense, so we will close this particular session on the with basically the summary that technology interventions play a very critical role in conducting effective assessments.